All right, good morning and welcome to our Tuesday morning live stream. I'm Ryan Grimm. I'll be your host this morning. Jeremy Scahill is traveling. Sharif Abdel Qaddus is finishing editing Drop Site Daily, which will be in your inbox fairly soon and may be able to join us on the back end of some of this. I'll be joined in a moment by my colleague, Murtaza Hussain. At around 10 o'clock, we're going to be joined by Maryam Al-Khawaja, who's a Bahraini human rights activist, to talk about the kind of Bahrain boomerang in which the U.S. and Israel went into this Operation Epic Fury with the intent on overthrowing the regime in Iran. They may wind up overthrowing the regime in Bahrain accidentally. We're going to talk about what's going on in there, as well as some of the other Gulf countries. Ed Augustin, a great reporter based in Havana, Cuba, who I spent some time with last weekend and has written frequently for Drop Site News, will be joining us later in the show. You may have read his front page New York Times article about the collapse of the Cuban healthcare system as a result of the recent oil blockade, as well as the last, going back to 2019, the real tightening of sanctions and the real choking out of Cuba. Courtney Bonneau, a journalist in Lebanon, may or may not be joining us. We'll see whether or not that becomes possible by the end of this program. If she's not able to join us today, we look forward to having her as soon as she can. But joining us now, let's bring in Maz. Maz, how are you this morning?
Good to see you, Ryan.
So the big news on the Operation Epic Fury is that the U.S. seems to be, significantly dialing back its ambitions. For a while, the goal of first it was regime change and a whole bunch of other things, but then they dialed back the ambitions. They said, no, the goal here is we're going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which was, to people who were following this closely, were like, wait a minute, the goal of the war now to return to the situation that was the status quo before you launched the war. Now they seem even to be backing off of that. So the Wall Street Journal reported last night that Trump was telling advisors he was no longer interested really in pursuing the war all the way until he can reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which you can talk a little bit about what militarily that would require. This morning he posted on Truth Social, and here is Alex Ward, one of the Wall Street Journal reporters, saying President Trump appears to confirm our story this morning, telling countries to, quote, go to the Strait and just take it. So I'll read Donald Trump here. Donald Trump says, of all of those countries that can't get jet fuel because of the Strait of Hormuz, like the United Kingdom, which refused to get involved in the decapitation of Iran, I have a suggestion for you. Number one, buy from the U.S. We have plenty. And number two, build up some delayed courage, go to the Strait, and just take it. You'll have to start learning how to fight for yourself. The USA won't be there to help you anymore, just like you weren't there for us. Iran has been essentially decimated. The hard part is done. Go get your own oil, President DJT. We can play a Hegseth in a little bit, but I wanted to get your reaction to President DJT here telling the world, go get your own oil. What does this mean for the role of the United States?
Well, it's not funny, but you almost have to laugh a little bit at the whole chain of events here. And I will say with the caveat first that Trump has shown that he's engaged in deception and feints and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right. This could all be fake.
It could be fake. He could be gearing up to launch some operation intended to open the straits. We can talk later about why that would be very difficult or cumbersome in general. But, it's in a big picture here, the entire basis of the American empire is that it's a maritime empire. It's a maritime empire which inherited the role from a previous maritime empire, which was the United Kingdom, or Great Britain and the British Empire at the time. So the basis for America's relationships with all these countries around the world is that it keeps these shipping routes open, and the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force are the tools by which global shipping is ensured, and these supply chains that everyone in the world relies on for what we consider the modern world can function. So if now very perfunctorily the U.S. is saying that we're not going to defend one of the most important shipping lanes in the entire planet, one where 20% of the world's energy comes out of. And these other countries, you go do it, countries that don't have navies which are designed to do that. And no navy in Europe or elsewhere, singly or combined, would match even a fraction of America's capabilities in this front. You tell them just go do it, that's basically like an end of the Cold War moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall moment in terms of dismantling the American empire. It's almost like the Suez Crisis in many decades in the UK, which kind of put the nail in the coffin of the British Empire. So I have to almost think that someone will have to intervene with Trump and force him to either launch an operation aimed at opening the strait or negotiating with the Iranians a deal which would result in it being opened for traffic going forward. Because if they don't do that, we're literally in a new world here. And even if the strait remains closed or subject to Iranian control and limited access and so forth, Trump is saying, well, we're basically an autarky here. We have all the oil and gas we need, and it doesn't really matter to us. Well, these things trade in a global market, so the prices affect everyone, regardless of you have enough or not. So unless the U.S. is going to stop exporting itself and just really deindustrialize the rest of the planet effectively by making such a decision, that's the implication of what he's saying. So I think we have to see whether he's serious about this. But there does seem to be consistent messaging. It was last night reported by the Wall Street Journal. It was posted today by Trump himself on Truth Social. But also in the press conference this morning, Secretary of War Hegseth and Dan Kane, the General Kane, managing the war, they kind of actually also emphasize this a little bit. They suggest,
let's roll War Secretary Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know you slightly addressed this already, but just on the Strait of Hormuz, is opening the strait an essential objective to Operation Epic Fury, or is that the job of those other countries? And then secondly, without asking you to comment on things that you can't talk about, what is your message to Americans who love the president and strongly believe in him, but are very worried about this notion of boots on the ground?
Well, first on the Strait of Hormuz, our core objectives from this podium, from day one, from me, from the chairman, from the president, from the vice president, from Secretary Rubio and others have been clear. Defense missile production and missile programs, so their entire missile program, defense industrial base and production ability to build, and Navy and power projection. So those have, and then of course, wrapping it all is Iran's never going to have a nuclear weapon. So those have been very clear. Defeating the Navy is a core part of ensuring they can't project that kind of power. But ultimately, I think the president's truth this morning lays that out very well, that this Strait of Hormuz issue, which we've set the conditions for success, and we will make sure Iran knows that very clearly, is not just a United States of America problem set. We've been willing to lead. President Trump's led the entire time, but it's not just us. So ultimately, I think other countries should pay attention when the president speaks. He's proven that when he speaks, he means something. And he's pointing out, might want to start learning how to fight for yourself. It's something some of us have been saying for quite some time. You can't just have flags, you have to have formations. You can't just have a few ships, you have enough to affect change. Those things matter in a dangerous world with ascendant adversaries. That's why the chairman's talking about our industrial base. That's why we're launching the Arsenal of Freedom tour to revive our defense industrial base. President Trump doing it in a way that nobody else has. As far as President Trump and boots on the ground, I don't understand why the base, which they have already, they understand, wouldn't have faith in his ability to execute on this. Look at his track record of pursuing peace through strength, America first outcomes. What he's simply saying, and it's exactly true, and I've said from this podium too, we're not going to foreclose any option. You can't fight and win a war if you tell your adversary what you are willing to do or what you are not willing to do, to include boots on the ground.
All right, so fight your own wars. You can't just have a flag. You gotta have frigates. We're not doing this for you. My favorite line there was when it comes to this Strait of Hormuz issue. We've set the conditions for success. Like, bro, you took an open strait, made it closed, and are now going to walk away. But to your point about leaving it to them, obviously they don't have these frigates. They don't. If the United States decides that it doesn't actually have the military capacity or willingness to open the strait violently, the idea that France is going to do it is preposterous. What France would more likely do is call up Iran and say, what's the price, and then you haggle over the price, because there's things that Iran wants from France. Now, if you're Israel and you're calling Iran, you're probably not going to get the same deal, which is what we understand in the world of international relations as sanctions. So now Israel and countries that do business with Israel are going to be facing sanctions vis-a-vis their ability to transit oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And you already saw the right-wing government in Italy is now joining the left-wing government in Spain, telling the United States they can't use their bases or fly their planes over their territory. You would imagine that would be the kind of thing that Iran would say, yeah, here's what it costs. And, it gets a little cheaper if you don't, if you cut ties with Israel on this, or, kick Israel out of FIFA, whatever. Like, all of a sudden they're a global player now because they have this leverage. So how do you see a world in which Iran is left to negotiate prices around Strait of Hormuz? Because I find it very hard to believe that they're watching, that these countries are watching this and hearing from Hegseth and like, yeah, all right, let's boot up and let's go invade and do this, since the United States didn't.
It must be extremely alarming to them. I'm sure they're hoping that this is a taco situation where he just backs off and does something. The problem is that opening the Strait of Hormuz is not a simple situation, and I think the reason that maybe they had not prepared for the situation or not really thought through Operation Epic Fury in this regard beforehand is because they were operating an older model where if you were to block a strait, a maritime strait, you need to actually put ships there. You'd have to have Iranian corvettes that they're bragging about sinking parked there, and then those could be blown up by a superior navy and things like that, or even like shore artillery batteries or something like that, which could be targeted theoretically. But what's happened now, there's been a revolution in military affairs, and that term, revolution in military affairs, actually came from the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, to describe America's precision destruction of the Iraqi army. But there's been a second revolution in military affairs, which is that countries are able to have these relatively cheap and effective strike weapons, which are, accurate enough to hit targets from a distance. And, you can't really, there's not really a fixed target to hit in return. So these Iranian attacks on these American radars, which I think people have seen in the last few weeks, that's kind of a new development. It wasn't really the case that another country could hit a radar, from Iran to Jordan in the past. But that's kind of something that these Shahed drones they developed are able to do. And now for the Strait, they don't need to park big ships there. They can just sit almost anywhere in Iran and fire a Shahed drone and shut down a ship sailing through the Strait once a week. And then the insurers won't cover the ships going through there anymore. So you've effectively shut down traffic. And it's a political decision. There's not really anything you can do short of basically invading all of Iran, make sure no one shoots at anyone from the Strait in Iran to stop that. So I think that ultimately there's two options. You can make a deal with the Iranians that you have to give them something that they want. And they're going to charge something pretty high now because of all the destructions happened in the war. In return for their political decision to open the Strait to the status quo before it was February 28th. Or you could, first of all, launch a ground operation. You could capture some of these islands around the Strait, and hopefully that puts pressure on the Iranians. You could invade coastal Iran and try to shut down their ability to fire from there. But then the problem is then you have to start invading more into central Iran to stop the fire from there, to defend your position on the island, to defend your position on coastal Iran, and so forth. So there's not really a half-in solution. It seems like they seem to be wanting like a Band-Aid solution that would solve this problem without a huge American commitment. And it seems like it's not really on the table. So now Trump is coming up on the 6 weeks mark of the operation he set out initially. Right. The Strait is closed. It's not any prospect for being opened. And he's this antagonism between him and NATO countries over other issues, over Ukraine, over their, unwillingness to take part in Operation Epic Fury and decreasing willingness to help supply it logistically. This is all coming to a head now. And then we see these threats and these ultimatums. I will say one last point. Hegseth was talking, when he's talking about the Strait, he's talking in a totally separate aspect about America's industrial base. And there is a conspiratorial view of this a little bit that, the U.S., the Trump administration talked about reindustrializing the U.S. at the start of the administration. They've kind of stopped talking about that recently. But, if you were to want to do that, one really brutal and effective way to do that could be forcibly deindustrializing Asia overnight by rapidly increasing the input costs for their industries, oil and gas and so forth, just really pulling the rug out for them overnight. And then, as they mentioned, again, America does have domestic oil and gas. It can stop exporting that and use it for its own purposes. You would generate unbelievable World War III level chaos in a lot of the world. But theoretically, if you're in America and you have a plan for that, you could use it to reshore industry here and so forth. I don't know if that's what they're thinking. I'm inclined they don't have any ideas like that, but that could be something you could, if you were very bloody-minded about it, extract as a benefit as a country like the U.S. situation.
Now, I think I know the answer to this one, but I'm curious for your take. If Iran had the capacity to put a toll on the Strait of Hormuz, so two questions. One, why didn't they do it before February 28th? And two, what other countries around the world are like, wait a minute, we have drones. Like we could block the Strait of Malagra. We could block the Red Sea. Well, maybe the Houthis are like, wait a minute, why are we not charging to get through the Red Sea? Egypt charges to get through the Suez Canal. But I think the answer to the first question kind of answers the second one. So I'm curious, like why, from your perspective, did Iran not do this on February 27th? Why did it take the war for this to develop?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, under the previous leadership of Ali Khamenei, Iran was actually quite risk averse in many ways. He was he was 86 years old at the time of his death. He had this policy of no war, no peace, which basically meant that you don't necessarily make full reconciliation with the U.S. because he didn't trust them. He thought it would be dangerous. But also, you don't seek full-blown wars with the U.S. or fully confront the U.S.-led international order by attacking shipping lanes and so forth. What's happened now is that the no war, no peace paradigm has collapsed because the U.S. attacked Iran on February 28th, and there's just a war now. And Ali Khamenei himself is dead, so his perspective is no longer relevant to Iran's own calculations. So they've taken more risks. They've taken more efforts to be confrontational or to do things they may not have done before. And the Strait is just one of those things. So it seems like they definitely had gamed this out before. It's not they hadn't thought about it, because they are shutting down the Strait in a way which is very effective and would make sense if that's how you want to do it. They're not trying to do something which could be easily reversed. They're using these drones and strike munitions in a kind of light touch way to shut it down. So, in one sense, they didn't have really the incentive to do it before. But secondly, they had also been trying to reconcile with the Gulf Arab states before this conflict. There had been a Chinese-led mediation process with Saudi Arabia. They had been trying to work something out with several of these countries. But now when the war started and, to some degree, the war was waged from GCC states against Iran, that reconciliation process has kind of gone out the window. And now they have a hostile relationship with many of these states. And if you're asserting your control over the Strait, you're kind of saying that you're the hegemon of that area. So whoever controls the Strait basically controls this extremely important geographic and economic zone around the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians are not saying we control it. So they've thrown an ultimatum down to these countries. And I think you're seeing now a split in the Gulf. The Oman and Qatar seem to be more amenable to working something out with the Iranians. The Omanis have a pretty good relationship with the Iranians on balance. And then on the other hand, the Emiratis and the Bahrainis are very, very hostile to this Iranian hegemony over the Persian Gulf. They're lobbying, by some accounts, for a U.S. ground war against Iran to stop that. And Saudi Arabia also may be involved in this. Their position is slightly more ambiguous, but reports have indicated that they're also lobbying for escalated U.S. action against Iran. I think the issue is that, and not to get too deep into history, but this is actually a huge historical turning point, however this shakes out, because these countries, the GCC countries, most of them were created by the British, or they're created out of the wreckage of the British Empire. They, were principalities basically, and they were very empowered by that order. And then when the British Empire ended, they were inherited by the American Empire, and they became very wealthy over time, protected by the American Empire. And this position and presence as a hegemon of the Persian Gulf, if the U.S. is now saying that it's the other people's problem what happens in the Persian Gulf. And, if you want to fix it, please figure it out on your own. Well, that's kind of a huge existential moment for these countries because they've never lived outside that sort of protection and that umbrella. So they can either accommodate themselves geographically to Iran, which is a huge, very sophisticated country that's existed across from them for thousands of years, or you could try to resist. You can try to rally, yourselves or others, rally America, rally Israel to maybe fight a war against Iran on your behalf, and they may be going for that. There's a split between the two parties inside the Gulf. So I think that unfortunately Trump has really smashed a very delicate and fragile order that existed, and it's very difficult to put it back together once you've smashed it.
And so then the second question: are we going to enter a world in which people just start trying to put up tolls everywhere? Like maybe the Somalis' problem was that they were, too anarchic about the way that they were doing piracy off of the coast, and that if they had more state capacity and we're just like, hey, look, these are our waters. You want to send ships through here, you just pay a toll and there will be no piracy. And as state capacity increases relative to the hegemon, if there's no hegemon to say, no, you're not charging tolls off the coast of Somalia. Like, we guarantee maritime shipping and we pay for it. You're not charging. Back off. If that doesn't exist anymore, could we see a world in which it's kind of everybody just grabs the leverage that they can?
Well, if this model that the U.S. is implying is going to apply to the Strait of Hormuz applies more broadly, yes, we would enter a world where, a world none of us have ever lived in before, because so much of the world we live in is based on these supply chains and the free flow of trade. All the assumptions we have are kind of built upon that. We don't even think about it really. But, if the Houthis or Ansar Allah decides to shut down the Bab al-Mandeb tomorrow and they want to charge a toll, and there's no one power to appeal to who's theoretically, entrusted with the role of making sure that there are no such tolls and all maritime shipping is free, then yes, we enter a very fragmented world. We enter a world of, it'd be by definition a multipolar world in every sense. And it would be one where, the frictionless globalization that's been the case for many decades is just no longer the case. We have a world of zones and fiefdoms and so forth. And maybe after a very painful adjustment period, that might be better, because the American empire, its stewardship is increasingly dysfunctional and chaotic and so forth. But it would have tremendous economic impacts to everybody. It would probably result in state collapse. Many states around the world, which had been created and exist on the assumption of an American maritime power, like several of the GCC states, they wouldn't survive, and that would be the case in a lot of parts of the world. So, I think that, with very little caution or forethought, we seem to be moving towards that direction right now. And again, this Iran war, I really wonder how much any of this was thought through beforehand, because it seems that the idea was that you just kill Ali Khamenei, things would collapse and reconstitute in a more favorable way. None of these second order effects were considered beforehand. And now they're generating this revolt and revulsion by many European countries who themselves at the time had seemed to endorse the war or hadn't really thought about it too much. But now they're realizing the impact on themselves. And I think we really are entering a situation where it could be an unraveling that we haven't seen since 1989 or even since the mid-20th century, playing out very chaotically and very abruptly.
We can call it the Belt and Toll Road. But we're actually quite fortunate to be able to be joined now by Maryam Al-Khawaja, who's a Bahraini-born human rights activist, and is able to then. Maryam, I don't know if you were able to listen a couple of minutes ago. We were talking about the way that the kind of GCC countries are splitting over how to move forward with this ongoing catastrophic situation that they found themselves in. And I'm always skeptical, and I want to hear your take on this too, of how much stock to put in these anonymous reports that appear in Western media that tell us what, say, the Saudis or the Emiratis or anybody, for that matter, is feeling. Here's from the AP just this morning saying, officials from Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain have conveyed in private conversations that they do not want the military operation to end until there are significant changes in the Iranian leadership or there's a dramatic shift in Iranian behavior, according to U.S. Gulf and Israeli officials. Now, I'm having reported on these Gulf countries for a very long time. I'm quite aware that and one man in particular, UAE Ambassador Youssef Al-Otaiba, is often kind of the stand-in for Western media when it comes to kind of Gulf officials. Like, they talk to him, and that's the reporting, and then they add on some American and Israeli officials, and that's how you could get an according to Gulf Israeli and American officials. On the other hand, he certainly does represent a faction of the GCC. So from your perspective, but first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here last night.
My pleasure.
So from your perspective, what should we understand about the kind of division within the GCC, and if it's true that they really want this thing to keep going despite what's happening on the home front, why?
I mean, I think, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you both. I think, when it comes to the GCC, there's a few things that are important to understand. First of all, is that there's been a severe crackdown, even worse than prior to the Iran war, on freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So we're seeing tons, dozens, in some cases, hundreds of people being arrested for posting tweets, for protesting, for, speaking out, saying their opinion, and so on. So this idea that you could understand how people on the ground are feeling, I think, is very unrealistic. And anyone who says that, this represents the opinion of people inside the GCC, I think that's not a statement that we can trust. And we've seen this over and over again. I mean, right now in Bahrain, the public prosecution is even pushing for the death penalty for people who have protested or have spoken out against the Iran war or shown any form of sympathy with the Iranians who are being bombed and so on. And so I think that's one part of it. But I think another part of it that's also just as important is that ever since the genocide in Gaza began, and we've been seeing live, everyone's been watching live what's been happening in Gaza. There has been, I think, there's been a huge influence and an impact on how much people trust mainstream media anymore. And so I think that also needs to be taken into consideration when we're looking at mainstream media, when they're, quoting anonymous sources and so on. People are always asking the question, but who's the anonymous source? Mm-hmm. Is there something behind this around what it is they're trying to achieve? And so they're trying to create a narrative for that goal that they have or for that objective. Is this being fed because they want to drive a specific, narrative in the region and so on? And then, of course, we've also been seeing how the Iran war has been used to also manipulate the markets. And so I think a lot of times, and more often than not, people don't feel as trustful of mainstream media in ways that they could have been in the past.
Right. Yeah. So then why would, let's say, like, what are the splits within the kind of GCC leadership at this point? Like, they clearly did not see this kind of aggressive response from Iran coming, even though Iran signaled for weeks and weeks and weeks that if you attack us, we're going to turn this into a regional war, and we're going to go after the GCC countries that are hosting American bases. Like, they said that publicly. I think they even sent a letter to the UN spelling that out. They seemed surprised by it, though, when it happened. How do they see the way forward here at this point? Like, what pressure do you think they are putting on the Trump administration to keep going, put boots on the ground, or look, we need to gracefully find an exit for this?
I mean, I think it's difficult to talk about the GCC as being in one basket, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think when we're looking at places like Bahrain, for example, they're using the Iran war right now as an opportunity to crack down on opposition, right? They're arresting people left and right, especially within the Shia circles. They're torturing people. We just had Sayyid Mohammed al-Musawi, who was tortured to death after just a few days of interrogation. The 5 people who are arrested with him are still missing, and we don't know what their situation is. And so they've really taken this as an opportunity to go after all of the people that they haven't been going after for the past years. And so I think when it comes to a place like Bahrain is also one of the only countries in the GCC that actually hasn't made official announcement that Bahrain is not being used for strikes on Iran, just so that that's clear. And so I think it's different from one GCC country to another. If you look at, for example, Oman or Qatar, I think, I mean, from what we've seen in their policies and their politics, generally, they're more on the end of how do we resolve this? How do we end the situation? And, you know, we've seen statements from, you know, for the Omani government, for example, talking about, well, these are our neighbors that we're going to have to live with during the war, after the war. And this idea that they're going to just disappear from existence is not realistic, and it's not going to happen. And so I think there are very different approaches from the different governments, but even within ruling families themselves, like I would say that you do have within Bahrain, the Bahraini monarchy, for example, you are seeing a lot of the people who are speaking publicly are very much, you know, there's some of them are taking on the role of, well, we need things to calm down. This war is not good for anyone. But then you're also seeing others saying the opposite. I mean, with Nasser al-Khalifa coming out and invoking the security agreements with the US and the UK, and talking about how, you know, we need to fight the threat of Iran and so on. So you're seeing different statements from different people. But the fact of the matter is that one thing that I think a lot of people are very concerned about, and I'm sure that it's also a concern for governments, regardless of how they feel about their populations, is the nuclear option that is being talked a lot about these days, right? Because if the nuclear reactor in Iran is hit and it's damaged, I mean, it's been hit already, but if it's damaged enough to actually release radiation, it's not just Iran that's going to be impacted. I mean, I never thought I would live to see the day where I have to start asking people inside Bahrain to start buying, you know, the iodine pills that you take for nuclear radiation if that were to happen. So I think there are many different positionalities, and we're seeing a lot of different statements. But I, for one, you know, have a lot of difficulty really knowing where to trust when we see these public statements. I think if the GCC countries are pushing Trump for a ground invasion or to continue the war, then they're not very smart politically or strategically, because it doesn't make sense. And as we've seen since the beginning of the war, the GCC has been, you know, receiving the impact or the brunt of the aggressions from Iran as a response to the US-Israeli war on Iran. And so this idea that, you know, the continuation of the war could in any way be good for the GCC does not make sense politically or security-wise.
Maryam, I want to ask you specifically about Bahrain too. You mentioned Mohammed al-Musawi, who was a young man who was kidnapped and then killed in detention. Bahrain obviously has a very unique position in the GCC demographically, because what happened in the Arab Spring as well too. It was a country where there was a very significant Arab Spring movement that was brutally repressed to a degree which probably was not replicated in other GCC countries. Can you talk a bit about why Bahrain is somewhat unique in this and why they've taken this particularly hawkish position towards Iran, despite the fact that they're one of the smaller GCC countries which may be more negatively impacted by Iran conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bahrain is different from other GCC countries in the makeup, I mean, the socio-political makeup of the population, as well as the historic positionality of the Bahraini people, right? The Shia makeup, the majority of the indigenous population in the country, the Al-Khalifas are considered to be occupiers, not a legitimate ruling family. You know, they violently took over Bahrain and then have ruled violently since then with the help of the British when they became a British protectorate and so on. And so one of the things that that makes Bahrain different is that for decades, the Bahrainis have been protesting against the presence of foreign bases in the country, for example. I mean, the very short-lived parliamentary system that we had in the 1970s was shut down after only 2 years, because they refused to renew the lease for the US base because they didn't want them there anymore. And then, you know, the emir at that time declared a state of emergency for the next 25 years, which led us, you know, to the 2000s. And so this gives you a very, very clear idea of the relationship between the ruling family and the population of Bahrain. And we saw this, you know, also at the beginning of this war with people going out and protesting and, you know, writing about how they're against this war, how the presence of the foreign bases in the country is actually a security issue for the population of Bahrain. And it's something that the Bahraini population never wanted. Part of the problem is also that all of these political decisions that are made by the ruling family in Bahrain, whether vis-a-vis, you know, the Abraham Accords or this, you know, they've also announced in 2022 that they have very close working relationships with the Mossad in Israel and so on. none of these represent the will or the opinion of the population in Bahrain. And so there's constantly this rift between the population. And of course, what the Al-Khalifas do and have been doing for decades is that they always try to paintbrush the majority of the opposition with whatever they believe to be the threat du jour, right? So, in the 1920s, they were all Nasser socialists, and then they all became, communists, and then they all became Iranian agents after the Iranian Revolution and so on. And part of the rhetoric and the narrative that the Bahraini government has created since 2011 during that crackdown and that uprising was that trying to paintbrush the opposition in Bahrain as all being pro-Iran, wanting to set up a, Iranian type theological system in Bahrain and so on, which even their own report said that was not accurate. The Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry that was, created. I mean, it was made and paid for by the king himself. And so they've been trying to create this narrative of this threat of the Shia majority within the country as being pro-Iran. And so that's what they're continuing with right now also. And that's why we're seeing such a heavy-handed crackdown on the Shia population. And you can see also the difference in how a lot of the videos that were coming out at the beginning of the war, if you listen to the voices and the people who are speaking in those videos that were documenting airstrikes and so on, you can tell that they're expats. And expats, not immigrants, because they're white and or Western. And so those people were not being arrested. Those people were allowed to post those, even though the government declared it illegal and so on. The people that they went after were 5 migrant workers and Shia Bahrainis. Whereas in the UAE, for example, you have at least 30 Britons who have been arrested for taking videos and posting them online. And so you also see a difference in how they do these crackdowns. But generally across the board, I would say in the GCC countries where we've seen a huge uptake in arrests, it's mostly been targeting Shia communities in this, this creating of this narrative and this environment that if you are Shia, you are suspicious just because of your sect.
And during the Arab Spring, you had the Saudis come in and help crush dissent and a popular uprising. Then at the beginning of this war, you had some rumors online that the Saudis were coming in again to crush dissent. What is the reality as far as you can understand about what kind of dissent there was at the early stages of this war? What, if anything, did Saudi Arabia do? And what are the conditions now, given the crackdown, but the genuine kind of bubbling hostility to the regime?
I mean, look, it's when we talk about like the use of foreign services and foreign, support and so on, that's something that goes back for a very long time in Bahrain. I mean, the Bahrainis, the ruling family has been working on changing the demographic of the country for decades now, where they have been politically naturalizing Sunnis from Pakistan and Yemen and Syria and other places to try and create a Sunni majority instead of a Shia majority in the country. And those people, upon arrival in Bahrain, they get citizenship and a job in the military or police, because the Shias are not allowed to serve in the military or police in the country. And so the idea is to change the demographics of the country, but also to create a privatized army that is loyal to the ruling family against the indigenous population. And so that's one part of it. But then you also see them relying and bringing in, British and American and other Western people that used to work usually in the police in their countries, and then are brought to Bahrain as advisors to the government. And then that's when you see them using methods of like kettling or crowd control and stuff like that they would take from their experiences in places like Florida in the United States or in the UK and bring it to Bahrain. But again, I mean, when we saw the entrance of the GCC forces, I mean, just to clarify, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia. It was Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It was the GCC Peninsula Shield, as they call it. And there have been rumors that they're back in Bahrain now. I haven't seen necessarily myself that there's been any evidence of that, but I wouldn't be surprised. We also have heard that they have brought in Jordanian riot police. We know since 2011 that they have had Emirati police officers that have been wearing the Bahraini riot police or police uniforms and working with the Ministry of Interior in Bahrain as well. The Bahraini government denied this at first until there was an Emirati officer who was killed, and then they had to admit that was happening. And so generally in Bahrain, that is the status quo, the use of, the Bahrainis like to call them foreign mercenaries, to crack down on popular opposition within the country. That's not foreign to us at all.
Maryam, I want to ask you two separate questions. And the first is, we started the conversation talking about the GCC's broader reaction to this conflict. And you mentioned you think it'd be very unwise for them to kind of egg on, a U.S. invasion of Iran or escalation of the war. Can you talk a bit about why you think that would have a negative impact in these countries? And secondly, a very different question. We talked about the situation in Bahrain. Your father is still imprisoned all these years. He was a very, very well-known Arab Spring activist, Al-Khawaja. Please also give us an update on his situation and also what's going on with him and other political prisoners. So those two questions.
Yeah, of course. I mean, to your first question, why is it a bad idea for them to egg on this war? I think there are multiple reasons. I mean, one, like I talked about with the nuclear reactors, if that's damaged, there are many countries that will be impacted. The United States is far enough that they don't feel like that's a threat to them, right? So why would they care about that as much? But for us, that's a very real threat. For the people living in those countries, it's a very real threat. But the other side of it also is that, this war could have been an opportunity for these regimes. It could have been an opportunity for them to unite their populations. It could have been an opportunity for them to release political prisoners and to say, now that the country is at war, this is a good opportunity to actually create more unity within the country, rally around the flag, what say you, and so on. But they actually chose to crack down further and to become more oppressive and to crack down further on freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and so on. And already in places like Bahrain, the situation was already a ticking time bomb. We already had hundreds of political prisoners. There's ongoing situations within the prison of people protesting, rioting, and so on, because they're not getting their basic rights. We've had several deaths within the prison system because of systemic lack of access to adequate medical treatment inside the prison. And now with the news of Sayyid Mohammed al-Musawi, who was tortured to death, who's actually a distant relative of mine, this has again brought back, like for me personally, I'm sitting, thousands of miles away from Bahrain in Denmark, and I had so many flashbacks of all of the bodies that we saw in 2011, 2012, 2013, and so on, of people being killed by the Bahraini government. And it does something. It does something to the psyche. It does something to the reaction and so on. And so I think this idea that they'll be able to control the situation while they're cracking down and while there's a war, I mean, if you look at history, history has taught us that that's not the case. When we look at why people revolt, why there are uprisings, there's even more reasons for uprisings right now in the GCC than we even had in 2011. And it's the same thing, there's complete control over public space since 2011. The judiciary has become the main tool of crackdown. I think Human Rights Watch said it best when they said that in Bahrain, you don't have a dysfunctional justice system. You have a highly functional injustice system. There's no due process. There's no fair trials, etc. The system is marred by the use of torture and so on. And so you're looking at a situation that it's not possible for it to continue the way that it is. And so we are going to come to a breaking point. What happens then? At a time when, for the past 15 years, the new generation has known nothing but violence from the government, and so on. And our economy is, shattered right now. The economy in Bahrain was already bad before the war. It's even worse now. And, my dad used to always say the uprising of the hungry is not like the uprising of the activists. It looks very different. You're not going to have people coming out to the streets raising flowers in front of guns. And this is what makes me very worried about the potential of violence, of what could happen if the situation continues the way that it is with the crackdown and so on. And in regards to the prison, I mean, the situation obviously has gotten worse. It took a long time for my father to get the monthly medications that he needs. He has heart issues. He has a lot of different health problems because of the severe physical, psychological, and sexual torture that he was subjected to. The last time I talked to him, which was about a week ago, he told me he still hasn't received some of his medication. They're using the war as part of the excuse for why that's not happening. But, these are medications for chronic issues. And so they're supposed to be already receiving them every month. So it doesn't even make sense. But they've also changed some other things. Like, for example, for a while, they canceled all in-person visits, which that makes sense to some degree with the airstrikes. What doesn't make sense is that they canceled the video calls. Since the beginning of the war, we've had one video call with my father. So I'm very worried. I'm very worried about what kind of precautions are being taken to protect people who are extremely vulnerable inside a prison. What happens if the prison gets struck, whether by an accidental misfire of interceptors, or whether it's an airstrike that hits the prison by accident, right? And so we have been calling. My father's a Danish citizen. We've been calling on the EU and the Danish government to try and get him out of there. As they are evacuating other EU citizens. So far, unfortunately, we haven't been able to reach much with that. But the thing is that my father might have an EU citizen. What about the hundreds that don't? Who's going to evacuate them? Who's going to make sure that if there are airstrikes close to the prison or on the prison, that these people are going to be protected? And that's why, this was an opportunity for the Bahraini government to actually try and close the chapter of 2011 by releasing the political prisoners and changing things. And unfortunately, they've gone the opposite route.
Last question for me. What's your sense of what kind of damage has been done to Bahraini infrastructure, the Bahraini economy? What are people experiencing on the ground there? What's it been like? And how are they feeling? Well, anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, I think it's interesting because when I talk to people on the ground, people don't necessarily feel fear that they are going to be targeted as civilians. I don't think that people are generally living in this fear that Iran is going to start to strike civilian areas on purpose, to create casualties or to attack universities or, hospitals and so on. That doesn't seem to be much of a concern in the GCC right now. Whether that changes or not remains to be seen, right? But so far, it seems that a lot of the understanding on the ground, be it correct or not, but a lot of the understanding on the ground is that Iran is targeting American bases. They're targeting, and in the times that there have been targeting of hotels and so on, they've also said publicly that they were targeting these hotels because there were US military personnel or Israeli personnel there. And so generally within the Bahraini psyche, and I think the psyche in some of the other countries as well, maybe the UAE less so, is that Iran isn't trying to kill as many civilians as possible. So there isn't, I know people who are still going out to restaurants and, getting their nails done and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think, again, we don't know if that's going to change. If the nuclear reactor starts, is hit again and is damaged fully, the impact of that is very different than airstrikes also. So there's so much that can go wrong so fast.
Oh, and on the hotels real quickly, I'm just curious if you have any sense. When I saw that, I thought this is unlikely to be, incredible signals intelligence interception by the Iranians, and more likely to be people on the ground who are saying, "Hey, 6th floor, those are all Israeli military or intelligence personnel," because they see them coming in with their suitcases and going up. Do you have a sense of whether there's enough of a kind of sympathetic population? I mean, this is kind of feeds into the Bahraini regime propaganda, but there's always some truth in the propaganda somewhere. Is that what's going on here? What is people's assumption? Because obviously you don't have direct insight into that question.
Well, look, I would say that, like you said, I don't have evidence-backed facts, right? What I do know is that Bahrain has a very well-functioning surveillance system, which means that it is very difficult to do anything online or to communicate with people without the Bahraini government knowing about it. And that's how they've actually arrested some of the people, is by, targeting them on X or on social media or whatever it is and finding out who they are for arrest. And so the idea that people can actually communicate, very sensitive information from Bahrain to outside of Bahrain without the Bahraini government knowing, or thinking that they can do it without the Bahraini government knowing, I think to me sounds quite unbelievable, to be honest. Right. I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I would say that if there are people who are doing that, they probably have nothing left to lose, and they know that they're going to be caught, and they're doing it anyway. Right. The other thing to also take into consideration is that in a lot of these hotels, it's not Bahrainis that work there. As with most of the GCC, it's usually migrant workers that work in hotels, and especially, in places like Jufair, which is where we have the U.S. military base, in Bahrain and so on, they're very careful about having the indigenous Shia population being in those areas. Bahrain is very much set up in a way where you have Shia-specific areas. There are unwritten laws about areas where Bahrainis, Shias can't, work or buy or rent and so on. So you have fully Shia areas and fully Sunni areas in Bahrain because of those unwritten policies by the government. And so this idea that that Bahrainis actually have access to that kind of sensitive data, to me sounds a bit unbelievable. And I think, with the Bahraini government, as always, we always say, give them a fair trial, give them due process, and present evidence. Because what we've seen for decades in Bahrain is that they never have the evidence to back up the claims that they make about people being part of, foreign terrorist cells or having been in contact with terrorism or terrorism groups outside. But then I think, and the last thing I'll say on this is also questioning the definition of terrorism and who the terrorist groups are. I'm not saying that I advocate for any groups and so on, but I do think that it's important for us to call out and think about who gets to define what terrorism is, who commits terrorism, and what terrorism groups are, and who doesn't, right? And I think that that's one of the questions of our time right now, especially with the Iran war going on, and with Israel and the United States being at the forefront of being, the people who are looked to define what terrorism is and who commits terrorism, rather than it being an internationally agreed upon definition.
Right. Well, Maryam Al-Khawaja, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciate you being here on Drop Sites Tuesday.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, you got it. All right, so joining us next is going to be Ed Augustin from Havana. Ed has written multiple times for Drop Site News, but he had a little star turn this last weekend on the front pages of the New York Times. In a piece that I can put it up here that everybody should read if they haven't yet, about the way that it looks like I got rid of this article. Brad, maybe you can find it. Oh wait, here it is. I found it. Never mind. Cuban patients are dying because of U.S. blockade. Doctors say Cuban healthcare was once the pride of the island. Now the U.S. oil blockade is upending even basic medical care. At the docks in Havana right now, and Ed, I want to get your take on the latest in this. The Russian tanker that people have been watching for a couple of weeks now was quote unquote allowed by the United States to dock and to start unloading its oil, which will take weeks to refine and distribute around the island. I say quote unquote because it's just it really emphasizes and underlines that it was a blockade. If the U.S. has to say, okay, fine, we'll allow this oil to go through, that's a blockade. So what is the status of the Russian oil tanker? And how are people kind of like, was this, I know when I was there was a lot of like people holding their breath that like this would be allowed to dock and that this would be some kind of lifeline. What is the current situation with that tanker?
Well, it docked today, and unloading is going to start soon. And from speaking to Cubans here in Havana, people are just relieved. They're relieved because it's a lifeline, and people are very, very aware that without oil, without energy, everybody's life gets worse, particularly the most vulnerable, right? Like obviously the president of Cuba, the military figures are not affected by this as much as pregnant women, as much as infants, as much as people in the East, as much as people living on a state salary. And so, yeah, people feel a relief. There's a debate about whether or not it's going to make a massive difference or it's a band-aid. But from the analysts that have spoken to the media, they predict that this is oil enough for 2, 3, or 4 weeks. And so that translates, people are very, very clear, regular Cubans are very, very clear, that this means that food prices, won't go up as much as they might have, that they'll be able to maybe get to university, that maybe if there's a broken antenna, and there's lots of them right where I am now, maybe there's a chance the state telecoms company is able to get someone there to fix it. And so for all of the sort of socioeconomic indicators that these sanctions are bulldozering, people are really, really clear that it's going to kind of palliate it and help them out. So I think relief is the feeling here in Cuba, a kind of caveated, guarded, let's not get our hopes up too much kind of relief. And I just think that it underscores how counterproductive from a genuine US national security point of view this oil blockade is, right? Because the Trump administration has been telling us what most US administrations for the last 6 to 7 years have said publicly and have genuinely thought that collapse is imminent, and you're going to be able to put a so-called democratic, probably Miami-run government in. But at the point we're speaking about, it hasn't happened, and it doesn't look in Cuba like it's going to happen imminently. And so if that's not going to happen, what we're seeing is that US policy is welding both the Cuban government and the Cuban people to be very grateful for and want to get closer to US adversaries. Like in the midst of repeated threats of US military intervention, Cubans are very nationalist people. Cubans are very clear that they need Iran to keep on winning the war. I don't have to tell you guys, Iran is obviously a US adversary. If they're going to get out of this fix, they need Russian oil and Chinese solar on very, very generous terms. And so it's just quite amazing to watch the counterproductivity of this policy. And it's one of the reasons why a decade ago, when the Democratic Party decided to break with a policy of regime change and embrace normalization, which, by the way, most of the establishment in the US had wanted for decades, the CIA, the Pentagon, Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, throughout the so-called deep state, people were really happy about it, because there is an acknowledgement that the pressure cooker strategy is not in US national interest. It leads to more migration. It could lead to more terrorism because people don't like their relatives being killed and sometimes react. In Cuba, there's no talk about that now, but generally that can happen. But a lot of the democratic establishment people were just talking a lot about how if we don't engage in Cuba, Russia and China will. And we see it playing out in real time very, very quickly right now.
And I want to ask, the Trump administration and Trump himself have made several very pointed threats about Cuba, in addition to the blockade. Specifically, you're saying that Cuba will be next, and implying that some sort of military operation could be, planned or expected in Cuba. What is the sentiment of people in Cuba around that? Is there a sense of expectation of it? Do you think that people would resist, or the government would resist if it came to pass? What is the environment there vis-a-vis these sort of increasingly provocative threats of action against Cuba by the U.S. military?
Yeah, I don't want to sugarcoat it, because there are people you meet who are just up to their neck in stress and impossible living conditions. And there is a sector of the population, it's not even a fringe view, it's a minority view, not a substantial minority view, but a minority view, that, if the Americans come, if Donald Trump comes, if they bomb the place to smithereens, if it's a targeted operation like the Venezuelan abduction was on the 3rd of January, with relatively few people killed, compared to how these play out, there is a section of the population that just feels so at their wits' end that it's almost like anything, like even if things get worse, we just can't live this anymore. And so that's something you hear on the streets. Cubans can be quite hyperbolic and quite theatrical sometimes, but people say it. And sometimes when I push back and say, "Really, you want that?" And people say, "Yeah, anything but this." That's not the majority view, though. I can lay it out like this: the Cuban government is unpopular. How surprising, because the crisis here has gone on ever since 2020, and it's been difficult, and every year life's getting worse. And so the government's been promising, changes around the corner, improvements around the corner. It hasn't come for maybe half a generation now. Things have been really critical since 2020, and they're getting worse. And so the government's unpopular. Certainly, population popularity of it has declined. Everybody in Cuba, from Raul Castro to right-wing and left-wing dissidents, want change. It's just obvious. How could you want this? There is a debate. There's no polls in Cuba, so we don't know, but definitely a sizable number of the population wants change within the system, within the one-party system. They're kind of like deeply loyal to what the revolution was, or they believe could be, or might become. Others want free and fair elections along liberal capitalist lines and want capitalism. That's definitely true. Which is more dominant, I don't know, because there's no polls. But it's clear from the interviews I've done and just the reporting that I've done, that the vast majority of the population do not want a US chosen government. And an even bigger amount of the population is against US military intervention. I was reporting from beside a US military base a few weeks ago, and every single person I spoke to, when I asked, like, are you in favor of US military intervention? Donald Trump's spoken about it a few times. They just answered me as if I was a lunatic by asking the question. That is deeply unpopular. That is not a divisive issue in Cuba. That is a divisive issue in Miami. We have polling on that. There is a substantial amount of Cuban American population in South Florida that are in favor of military intervention. I believe the polls show about half-half. But in Cuba, that is a fringe view. The last thing I'd say is that there is a section of the population that would fight. They've got obsolete equipment. They can barely train. They can barely replace the equipment they've got because there's so few spare parts. But there are sections of the population that would fight. And I see this on Facebook. There are Cubans I know that at the moment posting videos of them training with rifles. And so there is a section, probably a small minority, but there is a section of the population that would fight any US attempt to invade and control the country.
Wow, I think you're muted. Oh, Ryan,
Ryan, you're muted.
Okay. So, Ed, I was saying that the kind of the crown jewel of the Cuban Revolution, such as it is, would be the healthcare system. The way Cuba has invested much more heavily, as you reported in your recent New York Times piece, into its healthcare system than certainly any other American country. And as a result, as a result of its kind of holistic, free, preventive approach, had produced health outcomes that rivaled, or in many cases surpassed, a lot of developed countries. 2019, 2020, particularly COVID, you start to see a collapse and then an accelerating collapse in the last several months. You write about one pediatric hospital in Havana in your piece. I mean, you write a lot about the system more broadly, but you visited that hospital. Thanks to the news organization Belly of the Beast, I was able to go as well when I was there in Cuba, and I wanted to play a clip from that visit to the hospital with your colleague Liz Oliva Fernandez, and then get you to put some little context around that. So, Brad, if we could play, I think it's Cuba 2.
Una época hace ya unos años, no está relacionada con estos eventos, pero sí tuvimos como casi 2 horas sin poder encender. Es decir, hubo un problema eléctrico evidente en el hospital, que la planta arrancaba, pero no daba corriente para el hospital, y fue tenso. Me acuerdo porque yo estaba en quirófano ese día. Casualmente había un cirujano extranjero, estaba operando, el doctor Padidiguan de Australia, y él se impresionó muchísimo porque no es la costumbre que eso pase. Son momentos muy, muy tensos. Quizás dure 1 minuto, pero ese minuto te parece 1 hora. Y más cuando no tienes respaldo tecnológico, que batería, porque bueno, por ejemplo, a mí en quirófano se me va la electricidad, los cirujanos se quedan ciegos. Pero si yo tengo batería, por ejemplo, yo sé con mi monitor cómo está el paciente, si está bien o no, y la máquina de anestesia que está también con ventilación artificial está funcionando, yo estoy tranquilo. Pero cuando esas cosas te fallan, está ciego el cirujano y está ciego tú. Y el cirujano, tú le buscas un celular y alumbra y ve el campo quirúrgico, pero tú no tienes manera de ver nada. Es decir, o ventilas o examinas al paciente para saber los signos vitales cómo están. Y te digo que eso no tengo manera de describirlo. Hasta que tú no lo sufres, no lo pasas, no te das cuenta del estrés. Porque además sales de aquí a enfrentarte a lo que se enfrentan todos los cubanos. No hay transporte, no hay agua, no hay corriente, no hay comida, no hay esto, no hay lo otro. Y entonces ese estrés, por mucho que tú trates de deslindarte de ellos, siempre vienes cargado con eso para el hospital a tratar de hacer lo mejor posible, pero siempre te afecta. Te afecta que eso mismo. A veces tú estás normal, no tienes ningún paciente ventilado, estás en la sala tranquila y se va la luz y ya sales corriendo por instinto. ¿Entiendes? Igual me pasa a mí, a veces yo estoy en quirófano y se va la luz y yo sé que está todo controlado, pero tengo que salir corriendo porque es ya es un instinto, vaya. Estamos en modo, como digo yo, estamos en modo supervivencia.
And so, Ed, he's talking about the kind of instinctual rush to the ventilator. The power goes out, you have to rush to any patients that you have on the ventilator to to hand pump so they stay alive. It's striking me that as the power goes out, that's the first thing he thinks about, even when he knows intellectually that actually we don't currently have any on ventilators. So what did you as somebody who's been in Cuba for so long, what did you discover about the healthcare system today as it relates to 5 and 10 and 15 years ago?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize, I've been here 13 years, and up until the pandemic, the health system really was astounding here. Like if you look, you can find examples of hospitals that were falling apart, and loads of hospitals didn't have running water. Not hospitals, I should say, like polyclinics. Cuba's a battered place. And so when we published that piece, a lot of the US-funded disinformation system in Miami was trying to kind of do character assassination and say that the piece was faulty, and they were cherry-picking examples, and anyone can do that. But overall, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Up until 2019, Cuba had a lower infant mortality rate than in the United States. Life expectancy at birth in 2019 was 78. That's comparable to OECD, so-called developed countries. It had one doctor for every 100 people. That's an insanely high doctor-to-patient ratio. I think it's, from memory, 3 or 4 times higher than the US, maybe 5 times higher, and over double any other major economy. And so the human resources, what they lacked in technology and money, they made up for in a lot of competent doctors and just a huge amount of them. Really the last time you saw how impressive the health system was during the pandemic, because Cuba was the only country in Latin America to develop its own COVID vaccines, and they were damn good. They were over 90% efficacy, as good as the Pfizer one. And so this is a truly extraordinary situation. This in a continent in Latin America, 30% of people in Latin America don't even have primary care. And in Cuba, it's universal, it's free, it's preventative, and while we spend about 1/5 of the government budget on the healthcare system, which is very, very high, it's actually really efficiently run. So this was the context going into the pandemic. What happened is that at the time the first pandemic struck, so did the first round of Trump sanctions, and the Trump administration branded these as maximum pressure sanctions. They're pretty clear about what the intent was, and so you had this kind of double whammy, this 1-2 punch, in which just as the pandemic came and that caused a global recession, but particularly hit Cuba and the Caribbean hard because it shuttered tourism, which is one of the main kind of legs of the economy. It got hit with these really vicious sanctions that, of course, are caked on top of the pre-existing trade embargo and financial embargo that's been in place for 2/3 of a century. So the Cuban economy has never really been able to recover from that. And what's amazing is how much healthcare has declined. So the last time there was a huge economic crisis like this in Cuba was in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. And yet for over 10 years during the 1990s, every single year, because Cuba takes health, and particularly health of children and mothers, so incredibly seriously, infant mortality rates declined. And over that time, even though there was barely any light in the country, people spoke about light ups rather than blackouts, because most of the time you didn't have light. Children received a big bag of powder milk every month that worked out to 1 litre of milk a day for every child under 7 years old. And it just shows how resilient that system is. As one sanctions expert tells me, health will be the last thing to go in Cuba because it's what the society and the state values more than anything else. And we're seeing it go. We're seeing the indicators go. And I think something I'd like to emphasize is that it's not just the oil blockade, right? So in some media, because the oil blockade is so brazen and Trump's saying such absurd things and about, I'm going to take Cuba, it's getting a lot of coverage about how this is destroying the healthcare system. But this predates the oil blockade. It really started in 2019 when they hit Cuba with the maximum pressure sanctions. And the key thing that did is that it stripped billions of dollars a year off of an already very weak economy. So Cuba just doesn't have the money to buy stuff that healthcare needs. Doesn't have enough money to buy petrol to allow people to get to work even before the oil blockade. Doesn't have enough money to buy medicines. Doesn't have enough money to buy inputs for medicines. Doesn't have enough money to buy rice and beans and milk and folic acid for mothers and children. And so these things have really been wobbling for a long time and just gradually almost evaporating. And so the key point I think to emphasize here is that sanctions kill. they particularly kill children. There was a big study in the Lancet Global Health last year, a peer-reviewed study that calculated, because it showed causality, not just correlation, causality, that around the world sanctions kill over 500,000 people every year. That's roughly the same as are killed by war. And yet this is barely part of the conversation, because we're on social media unfortunately these days, and we see what happens in Iran and Ukraine, and you see a bomb fall on a hospital, and you can see someone blown to smithereens, and so you don't have to kind of connect the dots. With sanctions it's more subtle, it's invisible, but yet they do kill, they're deadly. And again, most of the people they kill, came out in our reporting as well, are children, because life, especially early life, is incredibly fragile. And so again and again and again, Cuban doctors, you heard Aliot talk about how he was operating during a power cut, and he has to keep the anesthesia going in, and he can't see the vital signs on the screen. That's horrific. And that child lived in that example. You have children, nurses in the same hospital making contingency plans right now for taking sickly children in ventilators and incubators, that if all the power goes and they don't even have enough diesel to back up in the generator, they're going to take the children out, wrap them up in swaddling cloth and put them back in to try and keep them alive. No health professional should have to do that. Whereas Cubans are just so used to just being like punched by the United States that you ask them about these amazing things, and as a Western journalist you're like, wow, how dramatic, and they're like, whatever, like it's life. Right. And then the other thing that came out is that in the main maternity hospital here in Havana, one of the head doctors was telling me that not only are women getting to the hospital later once they've already started, once they're very deep into labour, because there's hardly any transport, and that the neighbour that lives next to them can't whiz them to the hospital anymore and do them a favour, but also because of antibiotics. A lot of women are getting illnesses that are leading to extreme premature births, which are leading to more babies dying. And that's before you even mention that the cleaners aren't coming in as much as they should do because there's no transport, and so they're getting more sepsis. So it is really an image of suffering and death. And I can't emphasize how much admiration I have for these doctors, that really they don't have a salary that even stretches to the end of the month, and they're there battling to save lives, and they're doing it. Like infant mortality rates, as much of those as they've tumbled in Cuba, are still substantially higher than world averages, and given the external pressure they're under, it's amazing.
The doctor you mentioned, Dr. Aliot Fernandez at William Soler Hospital, we also asked him about some of those deeper sanctions that make it so difficult for the healthcare system to kind of just get what it needs. The lack of money is obviously critical and a first problem. Even if you have money, though, because of the way that the kind of terrorism designation and these other maximum pressure sanctions make it difficult for the hospitals to engage with the broader global economy, makes it impossible for them to buy stuff, even if they do have money. So Brad, if we could play Cuba 1, this is a short clip. I want to get your reaction.
Y los ejemplos que te ponen es porque entra carro y huevo y pollo a los Estados Unidos, pero la gente no entiende cómo entran esos carros, ni cómo entran esos huevos, ni cómo entran el pollo de los Estados Unidos. Los equipos médicos tú no los compras en una tienda, ni los compras a contado como tú llegas a un lugar y pagas a un mercado. Es decir, normalmente tú tienes que tener crédito en los bancos, dinero en un banco, o que te permitan hacer transacciones. Porque muchos americanos también te dicen, no, pero la ley no dice que no puedes comprar equipos médicos ni medicamentos. Es verdad, la ley no prohíbe vender medicamentos, pero ¿quién te vende si tú no tienes un dinero en una cuenta, si no tienes un crédito para pagarlo? Nadie te lo vende. Y también la regla del 10%. Y hay otro equipamiento también, que cuando tienes más del 10% de componentes de origen norteamericano, tampoco te los venden. Y muchas veces ni es así. Muchas veces las empresas no tienen respuesta del Departamento del Tesoro o de los FAC para poder vender a Cuba, que eso es otra cosa. Independientemente de la cosa económica, está la cosa regulatoria, que no le dan licencia para comerciar con Cuba. Entonces, estamos atados de pies y manos. Y si se siente el bloqueo.
So from your reporting, how important are those sanctions in the isolation of Cuba's healthcare system?
They're really important. The most powerful way in which those so-called maximum pressure sanctions, again on top of the pre-existing sanctions, Cuba's been sanctioned for longer than any other country in modern history. the main way in which they decimate the healthcare system is by bankrupting it, as we've spoken about. But then the other way they do it is just by tangling everything up and making everything impossible. So I'll give you an example. I met last year when I was making a documentary on the effects of sanctions, a lady called Unianis. Unianis is a black woman about my age. She's got an enormous tumor in her jaw that just keeps on growing. And it's painful to eat. She's embarrassed, doesn't smell very nice. And it's just this anguishing situation for her and her surgeon, because her surgeon, Guillermo, knows how to operate her. These are non-cancerous tumors. They're called, God, I'm going to forget it. Ablastomas, I think they're called. And people in their 20s and 30s tend to get them. This was a routine operation in Cuba before. There's basically no waiting list. Like normally this would be taken out within 3 days in the Cuban system, because there are so many surgeons, and because they prioritize preventing it. Now she hasn't been operated on for over 3 years. He knows how to operate it, but the point is he can't, because the 3D printer should print the prostheses to replace where it's eaten away against the bone is broken, and the company refuses to sell spare parts. Now here's the interesting bit. The company's not American. It's not from the US. It's a German company, and it's illegal under international law to use third country sanctions. I've spoken to the US Special Rapporteur on extra coercive measures, that's to say sanctions. They're very clear that the law says this is a big no-no. The EU even has a counter statute passed in the 1990s when the US Congress codified the sanctions as exterritorial. So in theory, and under international law, I'm told, Germany and the EU should be taking measures to make sure that the US cannot punish a German company for selling to Cuba. But in practice, it's never been put into effect. And so what happens is that you've got this company, I'll name it, SLM Systems, owned by Nikon, that sold a printer to the Cuban Ministry of Health for about €1 million about 10 years ago in the wake of the Obama normalization, and that since then has refused to sell spare parts to Cuba. And I've seen emails they cite because of tougher sanctions or harder sanctions. This might sound bureaucratic, this might sound that it's not too important, but if you go into the surgery when this surgeon Guillermo meets all of his patients every Thursday, you have dozens of people around my age with these huge tumors because of over-compliance, it's called, with US sanctions. So that's one example, just like a medical equipment company just said, we refuse to sell to you because basically we're intimidated by the US. You've got another example, which is that Eli Lilly, right, US pharma company, very excited, came to Cuba after the Obama normalization, sold insulin to Cuba. They refuse now to sell insulin to Cuba. What also puts a lot of these companies off is that there's been a big effort to create disinformation over the years, and there's this notion, it's not pushed as hard as it is with Iran, that Cuba wants to create biological and chemical weapons. And so you've got the whole dual use thing coming on, and a lot of this high-end medical equipment, I understand, could be used to create biological weapons. And so no company wants to be involved in that. And some of the legislation even says that you can sell to Cuba, but then you have to make sure it's on you to monitor it and make sure that it's not then sold to the military in case they want to make a biological weapon. And so this is just going to completely dissuade that from going on. The final one is the banks, right? So Trump in let me get the dates right, 2020, just before Biden came in, put Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list. They provided 3 phony arguments to say that Cuba sponsors terrorism. The Biden administration kept that in place all throughout their term, and then 6 days before they left office, the Biden State Department said, quote, "There is no credible evidence that Cuba sponsors terrorism," which begs the question, why was it on the damn list in the first place? Trump comes back in, signs an executive order, and doesn't even bother providing arguments this time. Phony arguments the first time, now we don't bother with arguments. It's just a terrorist country because we say it. And what that does is it sends compliance departments in banks haywire. So there's hardly any banks even in Europe that are willing to sell to Cuba. Hardly any in Latin America. None I understand in India. None I understand in Japan. And this means that, for example, in India, when the Cuban biotech sector wants to buy inputs for diagnostic equipment or for its own medicines, and there's, I'm told, over 100 companies that want to trade with them, it's really, really difficult for them to make payments. They presumably have to use things like crypto. And so even when they can scrape together the money, even when they can find a company that still wants to sell to them, oftentimes they can't even buy it then, because this bogus terrorist administration, terrorist listing just by one country makes banks around the world run scared of dealing with Cuba. The biggest ever fine in banking history was paid by BNP Paribas about 10 years ago, $9 billion, and about a tenth of that had to do with Cuba. And so I've spoken to people in the pharmaceutical industry, and they say Cuba, it's a small country, it pays late, why bother? But unfortunately, that translates into suffering and death.
Maz, do you have anything else? If that's all I got for you, Ed.
No, I thought great. So much for
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ed. Everybody go check out his story. What do you have coming next?
What we got coming next? I've got a few cooking. I mean, I think it's important to go to East Cuba because in Havana there's less than 20% of the population, and we're all enormously privileged in terms of access to food. The private sector's bigger here. People receive more remittances. There's way fewer power cuts. So I want to go out east. And if the last article looked at how babies are dying because the healthcare system is being battered, I think one of the things I'm keen to look at is elderly people and how they're eating, especially elderly people that don't have access to the private sector or family on the outside that can send them money.
Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. All right, that'll do it for today's live stream. On behalf of all my colleagues over at Dropsite, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting. If you haven't yet become a paid subscriber, please do that. You can also make a tax-deductible charitable contribution. If you're looking to send a little bit less to the U.S. government, you can just send it to us instead. You can find all of that over at dropsitenews.com. I'm Ryan Grimm. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.